Muy buenos días.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We have the authorities present. It is Wednesday, the 3rd of December, 10:09 a.m., and let's move on to item 1 and adopt the order of business. Secretariat, do we have quorum? We have now verified quorum by the Secretary, and I declare open this special session of the Permanent Council convened pursuant to items B of Article 47 of the Rules of Procedure at the request of the Permanent Mission of Peru through a note distributed as document CP/INF 10765/25 and addenda, with the aim of receiving a presentation on the topic of diplomatic asylum from the Minister of Foreign Relations of Peru, Hugo de Sela, who I'm delighted to greet and wish a warm welcome to this Permanent Council. With that, and pursuant to Article 43 of the Rules of Procedure, I submit for consideration by the Permanent Council the draft order of business as contained in document CP/OD-2572/25. If there are no requests for the floor, it is hereby adopted. Item 2 of the order of business. Now, we will be considering this item on the order of business. Along those same lines, I apologize, says the speaker. I need to submit for consideration by the Permanent Council concession of an exception to the time limits pursuant to Article 46 of the Rules of Procedure following a request from the missions of Peru, Mexico, and Ecuador. In that sense, we suggest authorizing, first of all, for the intervention by the Foreign Minister of Peru, 15 minutes, for the intervention from the Mexican delegation, an extension of up to 10 minutes, and for the intervention from the Ecuadorian delegation, an extension of up to 7 minutes. If there are no objections, those extensions are hereby approved. Now, item 2. Now, for consideration of the next item on the order of business, I'm delighted to give the floor to the Minister of Foreign Relations of Peru, Mr. Hugo de Sela. Minister, once again, welcome to the Permanent Council of the OAS, and I give you the floor for up to 15 minutes. Please go ahead.
Bien.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and Chair of the Permanent Council, ladies and gentlemen, permanent representatives of member states of the OAS, dear representatives of permanent observer states, Madam ASG, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to return to this home of the Americas, where I spent many years of my life addressing so many different topics which are of great importance for our region. But today I am here to discuss something that is very specific in order to hold a conversation with all of you. First of all, I would like to thank you for your support in holding today's meeting, in which my country will be presenting a topic that is of great concern. This is a concern that we believe is regional in scope. For that, I will be sharing some important considerations in order to outline the context of my intervention. And I'd like to begin by stating that I believe that we all can agree that this is not one of the best eras for our region, and I think we need to be very clear and frank as we understand that ideological differences have not ended because we have not been able to ensure that that which unites us prevails. This has become an era in which multilateralism has been frittered away, and we haven't been flexible enough to carry out our shared agenda in our region. Today, We face threats that are serious threats to our way of life and weaken our entire region. And I am talking about, among others, transnational organized crime, and that includes illicit drug trafficking, trafficking in persons, migrant smuggling, trafficking in guns and weapons, as well as climate change and corruption, just to cite a few examples. That forces us to address the need to find practical solutions that satisfy the problems that we are facing today. These challenges are numerous and shared, and they have scopes and causes that are often global in nature, and that requires us to be united if we're going to address them. But we have seen that this unity has been undermined by ideological differences, and as a region, we have lost the ability to hold dialogue, and with it, the institutionality that we need if we are going to fight these scourges in coordination. Against that backdrop, we have decided to bring the attention of our organization to a topic that we have shared when it comes to the present and future of diplomatic asylum in our region, as well as a proposal that's aimed at turning back its negative impact on international relations. We are doing this reminding you all that Peru is a democratic country committed to the rule of law, the principle of peaceful resolution of conflicts, and full respect for international treaties. At the same time, we are actively working to cooperate and progressively develop internationally and work on codification, as well as avoiding setbacks to multilateralism in order to address effectively the realities and challenges of a world that finds itself increasingly fragmented globally. In diplomatic life, this is an institution that continues to guide our region, and it has become one of our most important contributions to international law. It has been used to defend and promote civil and political rights, which make it a pillar of our democracy. It's not any coincidence that its codification through the Caracas Convention, adopted in 1954, was adopted during the context of the Cold War, where in Latin America we saw authoritarianism and political persecution prevailing. Peru has not been outside of these challenges, and that is why I'd like to bring your attention to the Aya de la Torre case, and specifically the ICJ's decision to ask parties to find a satisfactory practical solution guided by considerations of good neighborliness and courtesy, in which, and this is something that has always prevailed among Latin American republics, end quote. I'd like to bring this invocation to your attention in order to find a practical, satisfactory solution to the challenges that we face and which divide us today. Peruvian democracy, like that of all countries represented here, is not immune to these challenges. Over the last several years, we have undergone a series of political crises, precipitated in many cases by acts of corruption. Many of our former presidents and politicians from the entire spectrum have been forced to be accountable to justice. And our constitutional order, however, has shown that it is resilient, and we have seen separations of powers and guarantees for the administration of justice prevailing. And next year, we will be holding elections in Peru. They will be free and fair, and we hope to have OAS electoral observers as well as others who will be invited. I want to be very clear here in stating that we are not suggesting that there is any specific case of diplomatic asylum in question here. Over the last several days, we see one involving the former president of the Council of Ministers, Ms. Betsy Chavez, in Peru, nor are we bringing up other recent cases that have taken place in our region. However, we do want to underscore that these recent cases reiterate that we have seen a negative evolution when it comes to granting the right of asylum enshrined in the Convention of Caracas from 1954. And this is an evolution in which the main characteristic is that the convention is being used in order to grant asylum to those who do not suffer from political persecution in democratic states. This trend is something that we have observed as being supported in some cases on distorted information led by ideological biases which undermine our institutionality and our good neighborliness, and which are not in line with the spirit of the convention. I do clearly recognize that in our region and in Peru, justice is imperfect. In fact, we have seen threats to justice due to TOC. And yet, generally speaking, in my country, we do enjoy the guarantee of due process and the plurality of instances, and that includes supranational instances, which include the Inter-American human rights system. And above all, the principle of non-impunity prevails for us, and I'm sure that this is the case for all of you as well. This is sine qua non. We cannot turn around the diplomacy of the diplomatic century and turn it into something used for ideological criteria or a tool to sink justice. Circumstances prevailing during the era in which the 1954 Convention was adopted involved a continent beset by authoritarian governments against the backdrop of the Cold War, and it doesn't reflect the reality in which we live today. It doesn't help a democracy, nor does it help the rule of law if we undermine their politicians and their family members and the justice system, granting them asylum due to common crime. Quite the contrary. The government of the asylum-granting country then is being seen as a protector of individuals who, at least allegedly, have violated common law in their country of origin. And that is why it undermines trust from our citizens in the operations of their own institutions, as well as the fact that good relations need to prevail between our countries. Additionally, asylum creates conditions that may transcend the government that grants it, impacting the rights of asylees if that decision was made through a process that was not objective or standardized. We need to work together to address these challenges, and therefore we suggest that we do so, agreeing that when we assess diplomatic asylum in the framework of the Convention of Caracas and other instruments, such as those that are binding when it comes to fighting corruption, the nature of crimes be addressed and analyzed in an objective and timely fashion by the country granting asylum in order to ensure that they are trustworthy, and before deciding whether it is a good idea to grant asylum as requested. This requires the implementation of Article 9 of the Convention no longer depend exclusively on a subjective criterion, and rather on institutionalized proceedings that ensure objectivity, traceability, and responsibility on the part of the state. Our proposal is in line with the criteria of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in its advisory opinion 25 of May 30th, 2019, in which it states that this asylum should not be granted to individuals who have been convicted or seriously accused of committing serious crimes as outlined in international and regional instruments on terrorism and corruption. In the case of Peru, we also need to address our law on asylum adopted in 2002 in Article 6, which states that asylum may not be granted to individuals who are being tried or convicted before regular, ordinary courts for common crimes, or who have committed crimes against peace, terrorism, war crimes, or crimes against humanity as defined in international instruments. One important consideration that we have taken into account with this proposal is that the facts once asylum is granted, it compromises access to justice. The possibility for legal cooperation internationally in order to successfully carry out an extradition proceeding, and that is in line with Article 17 of the Convention of Caracas, leads to remote possibilities of success in a bilateral situation that has been weakened by granting of diplomatic asylum, particularly when that is motivated for ideological considerations. We also remind you that international law does not protect impunity during a extradition period for a serious crime by the requesting state. We still need to be governed by the principle of aut dedere aut judicata, or either extradite or try. And for this, normally we have an extradition period that will go hand in hand with a technical and legal period detailing the nature of the crime, its common nature, and also any guarantees of due process and sufficient evidence to sustain the probability of this case. One of our main concerns when addressing this topic before the Permanent Council is caring for the very valuable legal institution of asylum in order to strengthen it, ensuring it is used in line with the way in which it was originally designed, that is, to protect those who are politically persecuted. And that is why we believe that it's indispensable to agree on a prior obligatory proceeding that ensures transparency in the terms of Article 9 of the Convention of Caracas, establishing guidelines allowing for an objective and timely assessment based on verifiable information from the granting state and reducing any discretionality or individual interpretation of its implementation. Finally, we have been speaking with foreign ministers of many other countries and colleagues who share our concern. During these conversations, they have suggested to us the possibility of requesting an opinion from the Inter-American Juridical Committee. Naturally, we are open to hearing this and any other ideas or recommendations and holding a conversation on this with the aim of defending and strengthening multilateralism as well as any non-binding treaties, because we staunchly believe that from this process we will come out stronger than ever. And now we are distributing a document where we share 3 questions for the Inter-American Juridical Committee for consideration. Time ran out, but Minister, we will let you finish.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. I was saying that we are distributing a document right now that includes the 3 questions that we had given to the Inter-American Juridical Committee to be considered by this Permanent Council, and I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, Minister, for your intervention and for your proposals. I suggest that we fulfill the rules of procedure, and the proposal that was mentioned by the minister has not been submitted to the chair nor the secretariat, and the proposals that are being considered by the Permanent Council in order to be adopted must fulfill requirements in line with Article 48 of the rules of procedure, and that is that it needs to be distributed with advance notice in order to be consulted and to address this if needed with our capitals. And so once it has been submitted through the normal channels, then we can submit them for consideration by the Permanent Council so that the Permanent Council can adopt a position with regard to that document. So it is relevant that you are here, and I would like to note that today we will not be adopting any of these proposals. Obviously, later on, they may be considered by the Permanent Council at an upcoming meeting in line with consideration and rules of procedure as contained in Article 40 of the rules of procedure. I just wanted to share that procedural information with the membership so that there isn't any confusion. And so thank you very much for this information, and we would request that Peru share that with the Secretariat and the Chair through the normal channels. And now I give the floor to Mexico.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished delegations. Diplomatic asylum is one of the most important pillars for protection of human dignity in the inter-American system. And historically, our region in general, and Mexico in particular, have always supported and been at the front lines of that right and extending it. It is part of our humanist perspective. However, in the context of these meetings, it's important to underline that we are not in the adequate space for analyzing the application of the convention from 1954, also known as the Declaration of Caracas, and much less are we in the space to reinterpret it or to modify it. We have to ask if this special session is a genuine juridical effort to focus on a specific case that is the subject of controversy between two member steps. Mexico would like to highlight two fundamental ideas. First, it is absolutely necessary that we underline the fundamental right of the fact that we cannot modify or reanalyze an international instrument without the consent of all member states that have ratified that instrument. And neither can members who have not ratified participate in such an activity. The very composition of this forum confirms the lack of juridical appropriateness of any adjustment to our rules of procedure under the Convention of Caracas. Various member states present today are not states party to the convention, and others have not participated in this organization. And so while there's space given to outside parties, we cannot pronounce any opinion. We are a political organization, and we are not able to adjust an instrument that we do not have the power to adjust. Also, keep in mind the Convention of Caracas. There is an amendment process that must be followed closely in accordance with the conventions on treaty law. And any attempt to do it differently would be flying in the face of the convention, the Caracas Convention, and the inter-American system. Trying to initiate a process here to revise a treaty that is fully in force is not possible. It is equally in force now as it was when it was first ratified. And we could say the same of other political organisms of the OAS, that of Foreign Relations or the General Assembly. We cannot request that the Juridical Committee, the Inter-American Juridical Committee, or other organisms study a situation that has come out of a conflict between two member states that would distort its technical and juridical nature, and we would enter into political territory. We are exposing ourselves here to using an instrument to solve problems that are beyond the scope of this specialized organism. We insist that modifying or even discussing the possibility of modifying the convention without having all states parties present is contrary to the instrument itself and the elemental principles of these treaties. As a second point, Mexico would like to note that it was only after having extended asylum and requesting safe passage, having strictly followed enforce international law, that a special session was called for to review rules that are clear, precise, and in force, and have been so for decades. And this shows that there was no motive for such a step to be taken, and it flies in the face of the juridical principles that protect our sovereignty. And if we see a political push to modify this rule, we believe that it's not appropriate because Mexico has followed closely international law and its own constitution. The moment that this revision is suggested, we have to say that if there were a general regional view on needing to reinterpret this convention, that conversation should have been put forth earlier through viable channels, for example, the rules of treaties, and not for a specific case. International law cannot be reviewed or adjusted every time a state is not in agreement with the application of a treaty. In a specific case, this could also put into question the rule of law on an international scale, which is juridical certainty. We cannot invoke these desires when circumstances are adverse to our particular state. We do not want to distort the humanitarian nature of asylum, which is to provide immediate protection under this convention. Human dignity can never be subject to a political process of approval. Asylum is not subject to bilateral relations between the sending and the granting country, as Argentina declared during the regular session on December 11th of 2004. But 24, this is a collective process of the inter-American system looking out for our fundamental rights and human dignity. The international community has followed this regional practice as recognized by the UNGA in 1967. Authorizing diplomatic asylum will never be considered an unfriendly gesture on the part of any state. And under the Declaration of Caracas, we see safe passage, diplomatic asylum, and third, Mexico would like to firmly reaffirm that international law on diplomatic asylum is something that if we undermine this, we could see serious human rights violations, and that is why protecting human rights and sovereignty is something that we should all do as part of the international community. This is an ethical, political, and juridical commitment while always looking out for the safety of people. That is our responsibility, looking out for human rights and the inviolability of our sovereignty. And if we undermine these international standards and norms, we weaken the most fundamental architecture of relations between states, as well as the protection of human life that we have fought to protect for almost 100 years. We cannot allow for this breaking with international law when we have made such great strides and gone to such great lengths to protect and consolidate it. This is why Mexico demands that we respect international law. We take advantage of this session to reaffirm together our commitment to the protection of human rights, the guarantee of the inviolability of international diplomatic relations, and the international protection of treaties. As committed by this Permanent Council last year when we discussed Venezuelan asylum seekers, these are essential pillars for stability, safety, and peace in the region, particularly in times when, as we have seen, there is much questioning of international law and the international order. What we say and what we do and the motivations behind our actions are what is important. And this is such a decisive moment for our organization where we have been fighting to strengthen the rule of law, and we must show that we are up to the task and up to the importance of this moment. And I'd like to end by highlighting that we are in support of diplomatic dialogues on such issues as long as we are respecting principles and international norms that we all voluntarily supported. And following our fundamental premises here at the organization. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Mexico. Now, Antigua and Barbuda, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Antigua and Barbuda approaches this discussion, Mr. Chairman, conscious that diplomatic asylum is one of the oldest humanitarian instruments of our hemisphere. It was developed and later codified in the Caracas Convention at a time when instability, coups d'etats, and persecution were recurrent realities. In that context, the door of an embassy often meant the difference between life and death. That history should never be forgotten. Although my government, like other CARICOM governments that are represented in this Permanent Council, is not a signatory to the Caracas Convention, we believe the institution of diplomatic asylum continues to have great value. It remains a tool that can protect individuals in situations where their life, liberty, or integrity may be at risk for political reasons. Small states in particular depend on legal arrangements that protect the vulnerable against abuses of power. That is why we are signatories to the Vienna Convention on this question. At the same time, the Caracas Convention itself draws a distinction between political offenses and common crimes. It envisages situations of urgency. It treats asylum as temporary, strictly for the period necessary to arrange safe departure. And it establishes obligations on both the territorial state and the asylum-granting state. In other words, the treaty reflects a deliberate balance, Mr. Chairman. Protection for those who are genuinely persecuted, and respect for the proper administration of justice where independent courts are engaged. Now, Antigua and Barbuda wishes to be equally clear on another point. We agree with you, Mr. Chairman, that the proposals put this morning by the distinguished Foreign Minister of Peru are not yet properly before this Permanent Council. Therefore, we do not see the Permanent Council, and certainly not this meeting, as a forum to adjudicate a bilateral dispute between member states, nor as a venue to interpret or to appear to interpret a binding convention in relation to a specific ongoing case. That would neither promote legal certainty nor reduce tensions. It would instead risk politicizing treaty interpretation in circumstances where the facts and legal issues are contested and are being addressed through other channels. In its rationale for this meeting, the delegation of Peru has raised broader questions about how diplomatic asylum operates in today's world, including in relation to corruption, international legal cooperation, and the rule of law. Antigua and Barbuda recognizes that such systemic questions can legitimately be examined. However, if member states consider that further clarification is useful, that work should be undertaken in a way that is general, impartial, and non-adversarial, and not tied to any particular national proceedings or diplomatic incident. In that regard, Mindful of the observations made this morning by the distinguished ambassador of Mexico, Antigua and Barbuda would be prepared to support the Permanent Council if, at an appropriate meeting, with a consensus resolution before it, then decides to invite the Inter-American Juridical Committee to examine, from a strictly legal perspective, the contemporary application of the Caracas Convention, including its interaction with current human rights obligations, and to present its analysis to the Council. Mr. Chairman, I'm mindful that I'm running out of time, so if you give me 30 seconds, I'd like to try to finish this. Now, should such a request be put before the Permanent Council, a request that would not seek to alter the Convention, would not prejudice any bilateral matter, and would provide member states with technical guidance rather than political pronouncements, that would be something that we ought to consider. For a small state like mine, what is at stake is the integrity of the American legal order, the inviolability of diplomatic premises, the clarity of treaty commitments, and the equity.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks. Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Brazil has historically recognized those who are suffering from political persecution for their political opinion, and they have the right to protection even outside of the borders of their country of origin. And in Brazil, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, as well as other instruments. And Decision 2312 of the UN General Assembly notes that asylum must be respected by other states, and also determines the qualification of the crime that leads to persecution, and that has been requested by Brazil. And so this has been a specific contribution from Brazil to Latin America and international law enshrined in many different instruments, such as the Convention of Caracas, Montevideo, and Havana. And yet we note that there is positive law as well as customary regional Latin American law as precedents, and these instruments are often used during times of turbulence in the region. We also saw them during the military regimes of the 60s and 70s, as well as more recently, and that is why our constitution in Brazil from 1988, adopted when we returned to democracy ourselves, enshrines Brazil with the policy of respecting the principles that guide our international relations. And we do not believe we need to require additional requirements that would impact any decision to grant asylum. And this is simply a unilateral decision of the granting country. We can decide whether to grant or deny this asylum, and that is why we must ensure that we avoid any hampering of international relations. And any differences between the territorial state and the asylum granting state with regard to the implementation of this instrument must be addressed through any available mechanisms when it comes to diplomatic law, as noted by the Inter-American Juridical Convention in CJ 023 of 2023. Chair, we will continue to strongly and robustly defend the Brazilian Institute and international law, and work to reduce tensions between countries in order to address the humanitarian issue. And we have no doubt that democracy and the rule of law, as different regions of the Americas, have shown advancement, particularly when we compare it to the moment in which the Caracas Convention was signed. But no democracy, even if it is a model, is immune from attacks, coup d'etat, whether classic or not. And that is why we are in the middle of the 21st century. We have many different cases of attempted coups or coups and social conditions that undermine democracy and human rights for many citizens and political activists. That is, we know that the turbulence that leads to the need for political asylum have not been left in the past, and we will not turn back history, even in the countries that are considered most stable. Brazil believes that our region, which is very proud of the Institute of Asylum, cannot twist around these mechanisms which were adopted during the 20th and 21st century and are more necessary than ever. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you for your remarks. Argentina, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Assistant Secretary General, allow me to give a warm welcome to the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Peru, Hugo de Sela. This is a country, Peru, that has always been in solidarity with Argentina in critical moments and maintained that solidarity up until today, no matter what the political or ideological orientation of its government was. And we understand the questions very well. Argentina is thankful for this meeting, this special session of the Permanent Council related to diplomatic asylum, which is an institution that is profoundly rooted in inter-American system. And today, more than ever, it should be used as a tool to protect those who are suffering from political persecution. We are part of the convention that was adopted in 1954 in Caracas, and I'd like to highlight a central element of our position. Diplomatic asylum is an exceptional method. It is not a political, an open, or discretionary tool, but a legal tool that requires the strict adherence to specific criteria according to the Declaration of Caracas, particularly the existence of an objective situation in which the person in question is at risk of losing their life, or if there is a severe and active threat because of political motivations. The decision of extending asylum can be political, but it must be legally examined in order to be valid. The criteria that were established in the convention must be established. And qualifying the case, the charges against the person as established under Article 4 of the Caracas Declaration. However, the power of the state that is considering asylum has to look at there's both sides. There's the asylum granting state and the sending state. And at any time, the request can be made that the person seeking asylum is turned back to their country, but they must not be under threat of personal, whether that's physical, political, and their safe passage must be guaranteed. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights, in their consultative opinion 2518, recognized that the right to seeking asylum is a human right. And in the Inter-American system, it is binding, and that means that we all have the collective responsibility to protect the rights of those seeking asylum, despite specific cases that might come up. Mr. Chair, on this base, I would like to refer to the case that came up in our country in 2024. Argentina, within the framework of the Convention on Diplomatic Asylum, extended asylum to 6 Venezuelan citizens who were opposition figures to Maduro. And those people were in an objective situation of danger for their physical integrity because of arrest warrants that were obviously political in nature. They looked for refuge in the Argentinian embassy in Caracas and stayed there despite a lack of safe passage extended by Venezuela. Venezuelan authorities attacked this residency. They closed down streets, they cut water and electricity, they restricted access to food, and they used snipers nearby, clearly violating the sovereignty of diplomatic relations. Instead of providing safe passage, they attacked, and intimidated. We do not accept the diplomacy of silence, and if we have to defend human rights, we must do so, or we have no problem doing so, with every megaphone at our disposal, because what is in play or at risk is clear. From the Declaration in 1954, it has opened the door to this tool of diplomatic asylum. And what we have seen throughout the decades is that we have a series of shared expectations when it comes to this institution as an expression of solidarity in the face of political persecution and ruptures with the international or diplomatic order. This is not just a bilateral difference of opinion or one example. We are talking about the structure, the use of this important tool and institution, and the ability of the inter-American system to protect those people who are facing political persecution. We are... Mr. Ambassador, I'll give you 30 seconds so that you can finish. Mr. Chair, Argentina is committed to the fundamental principles of this organization and will try to be a bridge builder in every situation where there is tension between brother and sister countries. And we are here to participate in any dialogue for these questions, always with the perspective of maintaining unity in our diversity. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. I have 30 seconds. I have the discretion of being able to extend your time by 30 seconds, just in case anyone's mic is cut off. I will now give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The United States thanks Peru for requesting this special meeting and Foreign Minister de Sela for his presentation. This is a timely and difficult discussion coming amid several serious incidents involving diplomatic premises in our region. As Ambassador Rizzuto noted in setting our approach for today, a constructive, principled exchange is the best way for this Council to address difficult issues and reinforce the norms that keep our hemisphere safe and secure. At the same time, we recognize that host countries have an obligation under international law to respect the inviolability of diplomats and diplomatic missions. The United States condemns violations of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. We are equally concerned by siege tactics that effectively trap people inside and place diplomatic missions under sustained pressure. For example, we called for safe passage and worked with partners to ensure that Venezuelan opposition staff, who were effectively held for over a year, could reach safety. While the United States is not a party to the 1954 Caracas Convention on Diplomatic Asylum and does not recognize diplomatic asylum as a general rule of international law, our practice is grounded in the Vienna Conventions and in our domestic asylum and refugee frameworks. But we share the region's interest in preventing new crises and in ensuring that any use of diplomatic premises for protection is consistent with international law and with respect for state sovereignty and the rule of law. In that spirit, we appreciate the technical work available within the OAS. For example, thought leadership available through the Inter-American Juridical Committee, and where appropriate, the Inter-American Commission and Court of Human Rights, to clarify good practices, how to handle disputes over asylum, how to avoid escalation, and how to balance legitimate protection needs with the imperative to combat corruption and uphold domestic judicial processes. Whatever our differences are on particular cases, we believe all member states should be able to agree on three basic principles. First, respect for the inviolability of diplomatic missions and diplomatic personnel. Second, no harassment or siege tactics against diplomatic missions. And third, responsible use of protection mechanisms that do not turn embassies into permanent safe havens for impunity. The United States will continue to stand up for diplomatic inviolability, for the safety of those facing genuine political persecution, and for the rule of law and accountability across our hemisphere. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Muchas gracias a Estados Unidos.
Thank you, United States, for your remarks. And now I will hand the floor over to Uruguay.
Señor presidente.
Chair, thank you very much first for convening this special session. And also warm greetings to the Minister of Foreign Relations from Peru for his presentation today. We'd like to reiterate our unbreakable commitment to international law, peaceful conflict resolution, and protection of human rights. These are principles that guide all of our acts in the inter-American and international realms. Against this backdrop, we would like to underscore the fact that these instruments aimed at protecting all persons from persecution are valid, and the Convention of Vienna on Diplomatic Relations from 1961, as well as the Caracas Convention on Diplomatic Asylum from 1954, both ratified by Uruguay. The right to diplomatic asylum, as stated here, is part of the political and institutional tenets of Latin America, and it is a historic contribution from Uruguay. It's an institution that has provided protection to thousands of individuals, including thousands of Uruguayans. And it is a central part of our regional legal identity. And any debate on its implementation or the scope of diplomatic asylum must be held with the objective of strengthening, preserving, and not weakening this mechanism or any interpretations that may twist its original intent. The Convention of Caracas must be interpreted in full, in line with the principles of international law, and it must be implemented in good faith between states parties. Chair, I remind you that in the face of the events that took place in 2024 related to Venezuelan citizens at the diplomatic residence of Argentina in Caracas, Uruguay consistently sustained the need to respect the inviolability of diplomatic buildings, as well as the obligations of ensuring any requests for safe passage with celerity. And also, when we must accept asylum applications, we have done so with transparency and seriousness, and implement the requirements of that institution and carefully reviewing any information provided by the state. This background reiterates the seriousness with which Uruguay addresses any issue related to diplomatic asylum, and with that same seriousness, we hope for a resolution of the two cases that are currently being considered at the Inter-American Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice, that address this topic. Chair, we take note of the proposal sent by Peru, and we always value the resource of any instance available and international and inter-American institutions, and we hope to improve any legal text, but not based on conjectural situations, which should not in any way, shape, or form paralyze fulfillment of our obligations stemming from the Caracas Convention, or limit any protection provided by an institution of asylum which is fully enforced in our countries. Finally, we reiterate the importance of international and regional cooperation. In this spirit, we express our sincere desire for Peru and Mexico to, in the very near future, reestablish in full their diplomatic relations, strengthen their historic ties between those two countries. Thank you very much.
Por su intervención.
Thank you, Uruguay. Guatemala, please.
Gracias.
Thank you. I would like to greet the Chair of the Permanent Council, Tomas Pascual, and the ASG, Laura Gil, Honorable Minister of Foreign Relations of Peru, Hugo de Sela. Dear Permanent Representatives, ladies and gentlemen, my delegation recognizes the presence of the Minister of Foreign Relations of Peru, and we thank him very much for his presentation on the institution of diplomatic asylum in the framework of the Caracas Convention from 1954. This allows us the opportunity to reiterate the principles that have guided the inter-American system in this area. The Caracas Convention represented in its time a milestone in regional international relations and codified a practice in Latin America and the Caribbean. Its design is balanced and recognizes the sovereignty of states as well as the need to provide immediate protection to individuals whose integrity and liberty are at risk due to political activities. And this explains the necessity of this instrument and its relevance in times of turbulence. And we share the concern of the member states when it comes to strengthening the fight against corruption, strengthening democracy, international legal cooperation, as well as the preservation of the rule of law. These are legitimate, necessary goals for our societies. However, it's also important for these ends not to be indirectly translated into undue restrictions on the right to request and grant asylum, nor any protection provided by the Caracas Convention to anyone who is subjected to lawfare for political reasons. In this sense, we believe that the existence of democratic institutions and legal systems, although they are not enough on their own, are not enough to discount the possibility of political persecution. And we note that during times of apparent institutional normality, there may be pressure placed on independence of the judiciary or practices that impact due process. Specifically for that reason, diplomatic asylum is very much valid as a way to ensure human life and the lives of many people, as well as the rule of law. And we consider that any differences in interpretation on the application of the Caracas Convention must be addressed through respectful dialogue in line with international practices by states party to the convention. Finally, Chair, I'd like to reiterate that our reflection on diplomatic asylum should not be understood as a judgment on any internal proceedings during in one state, but rather a collective affirmation assumed by everyone under the Convention of Caracas and the Inter-American system. From this perspective, Guatemala will continue to support any initiative aimed at preserving the integrity of the Inter-American regime of asylum, respecting the inviolability of diplomatic buildings, and ensure peaceful, constructive solutions to improve relations between states.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Guatemala, for your intervention. The Dominican Republic.
Señor Presidente, Señora Secretaria.
Chair, Madam ASG, my delegation would like to first of all salute the presence of His Excellency Ambassador Hugo de Sela, the Foreign Minister of Peru, and we also greatly value his presentation this morning. Similarly, we express our recognition to the Peruvian delegation for the initiative in convening this session aimed at addressing a traditionally relevant topic. The DR values this space. It is an opportunity for us to reflect with serenity and legal vigor on topics that historically have guided asylum in our region. And this is a mechanism enshrined in inter-American instruments and complemented by universal standards that has allowed us to ensure a way to protect lives during contexts of political instability and individual risk. Therefore, we underscore that appropriate implementation of these instruments depends on, above all, fulfillment of international obligations shouldered by the states, as well as respect for the principles contained in contemporary legal systems, the inviolability of diplomatic missions, the sovereignty of states, non-intervention, and peaceful conflict resolution. These are essential to ensuring reciprocal trust, which makes it possible for us all to live together diplomatically. The institution of asylum in any of its modes aims, first of all, to provide protection for anyone who faces a concrete threat to their integrity or their fundamental rights. That is why it is the responsibility of states to ensure implementation of this legal figure within the legal framework consistently in line with humanitarian principles that allow us to avoid situations that may undermine diplomatic institutions or harm relations between states. The Dominican Republic also recognizes that political and social dynamics in our continent present challenges, and we invite states to update or review their legal frameworks. Yet, any reflection on potential improvements or adjustments to instruments in force must be done through processes of dialogue that are inclusive, respectful, and aimed at building consensus, always ensuring stability of the inter-American system and respect for essential principles that guide it. With that in mind, we urge member states to act with very careful prudence as we address any potential updates or modification of the 1954 Caracas Convention, and any review or revision of such a sensitive instrument must consider the challenges of today as well as any political divergences present in the region. This will allow us to avoid conjectural circumstances from undermining the solidity and robustness of asylum in our region. We recognized the path toward conflict resolution and building lasting solutions. On behalf of that commitment, we urge member states involved in recent tensions to strengthen channels for communication and prioritize communication with a view toward fully restoring trust and normality in the development of their relations. Finally, we reiterate our commitment to international law with protection for human rights and respect for the standards that govern the operations of the inter-American system. We hope that this council will continue to remain a space for understanding, dialogue, and defense of the values that we all share as a region. Thank you very much, Chair.
Muchas gracias a República Dominicana.
Thank you very much to the DR, Ecuador.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to Peru for requesting today's special session of the Permanent Council with the aim of discussing the topic of diplomatic asylum and assessing how we have been implementing the Caracas Convention of 1954 in the last several years, as well as how to address contemporary challenges when it comes to fighting corruption, legal cooperation internationally, as well as preserving the rule of law. We also thank the Minister of Foreign Relations of Peru, Mr. Hugo de Sela, for his presentation this morning. Ecuador shares the spirit with which this special session has been convened. The institution of diplomatic asylum has been very important in relations in our region in a particular context of coup d'etat and internal violence. For a long time, we faced these challenges in our region after independence, and at the time we did not have democratic institutions or stability. And against that backdrop, frequently individuals were persecuted due to their political ideas in a way that endangered their life, liberty, or personal integrity. The political situation in the region has changed drastically in the last 70 years since the adoption of the Caracas Convention, and democratic principles have been consolidated in our region. This includes fundamental principles such as separation of powers, and now acts of violence due to political opinions are the exception. We share Peru's concern with the fact that over the last several years we have seen the use of diplomatic asylum that is not necessarily in line with the spirit of the Caracas Convention, and that resource has at times facilitated individuals who have been condemned or convicted or tried for crimes being given asylum, including in cases of intolerable impunity, and we must strengthen the institution of diplomatic asylum and ensure its end is preserved. We have shared our opinion on the various aspects of diplomatic asylum, but we'd like to take this opportunity to share a few items that we believe are essential. The Caracas Convention must be interpreted in line with the rules of interpretation reflected in the Vienna Convention on those treaties. Particularly, the convention must be interpreted in good faith, in spirit with the terms of the treaty, and considering its aim and objective. We must also systemically interpret it, ensuring that any pertinent standard of international law applicable in relations between states parties to the convention prevails, and we must also consider any ulterior practice in states in implementation of the convention. Diplomatic asylum can only be granted when conditions set out by the convention are met. Particularly, asylum is appropriate when a person is persecuted due to political crimes or opinions. Also in line with Article 5, asylum may only be granted in cases of emergencies. Both conditions must be met in order to grant asylum. Article 3, on the other hand, indicates that it's not appropriate to grant asylum to persons who, when requesting it, have been tried or convicted before regular competent courts for common crimes, or have been convicted for those crimes or those courts without having fulfilled any respective sentence. And the diplomatic installations or facilities where they may find should then return them to the country where they find themselves, and any granting of asylum that does not fulfill these conditions is a violation of the convention and leads to international liability for the granting state. And it is also a violation of the principle of non-intervention in internal affairs of other states and obstructing the normal functioning of their justice systems. Article 9 of the convention contains the obligation of the asylum granting state to consider information provided by the territorial state in order to form its criteria when it comes to the nature of the crime, and this is necessary for the operations of this institution and good faith, and establishes a minimum of ensuring objectivity if the conditions for asylum set out by the convention are met in circumstances seriously considering all of the information provided by the territorial state with regard to this case. Article 8 of the convention states that the asylum granting state must communicate to the territorial state that they have granted asylum in line with the principle of good faith and other principles of the communication. That communication must also ensure information considered by the asylum granting state in reaching this decision, and the convention must be adopted systemically in light of the standards of international law that are applicable. In this context, it is extremely important for states to consider, in particular, the existing treaties when it comes to anti-corruption, such as the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption from 1994 and the UN Convention Against Corruption from 2003. These conventions contain obligations that seek to, inter alia, prevent and punish crimes of corruption and promote and strengthen cooperation between states in this area. Finally, it's important to underscore that respect for the Caracas Convention in full, along with other applicable standards, is essential in order to not undermine fundamental standards of international law, which govern diplomatic relations between states in the region. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Ecuador, por su intervención.
Thank you very much, Ecuador. Colombia, please. Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you very much to all of those at the head table. It has been an honor. Particularly, thank you very much to the Minister of Foreign Relations of Peru, whose presentation we are very grateful for, as well as thank you very much for asking to convene this meeting. And also, thank you for strict adherence to the rules of procedure by the chair of the Permanent Council when it comes to the document that's been distributed. Colombia has not ratified the Caracas Convention on Diplomatic Asylum in 1954. There have been some considerations, and I believe we are now working to actually ratify that. But Colombia has historically defended diplomatic asylum as a fundamental institution of international law, with adherence to humanitarian principles and standards from the Inter-American human rights system. The political constitution of Colombia from 1991 in Article 36 recognizes the right to asylum, and Law 2136 regulates granting that relief. And this is something granted to individuals with reasonable fear of persecution for political reasons or due to political crimes that excludes common crimes related to that without a legitimate end. And we particularly note the proposal that's being debated, and from a preventive approach, we express our interest in preserving the integrity of diplomatic asylum as a sovereign and obviously humanitarian figure. So we'd like to highlight two traditionally substantial ideas that must be preserved. First of all, the sovereign ability of the asylum granting state to qualify the legal nature of the persecution involved, and two, the protective nature aimed at ensuring life, liberty, and integrity of the asylee. And along these lines, we consider that this is a figure that should not evolve and become anything involving additional mechanisms or needs for control by the territorial state from which the person seeking asylum has fled. And so we need to ensure that we are committed to the primary ends of ensuring effective protection. The proposal we have received contradicts the inter-American system and jurisprudence, as well as legal precedents, which state that the freedom to make a decision on asylum falls entirely on the asylum granting state. And so any additional mechanisms would violate the principle of asylum, and also the 1954 Convention does not involve any mechanism for reform. And in that, we underscore that any regional debate must be carried out, avoiding any extension of the interpretive value of this instrument beyond the context of its adoption, particularly as evidence of any activities after its signing. We must act in good faith in line with Article 31 of the Vienna Convention when it comes to the law of treaties, and that is why these circumstances are where we signed one by one we fully support all of the statements made by Mexico this morning. To conclude, Chair, diplomatic asylum is a historic and legally valuable institution shared in inter-American legal history, and preserving it is a responsibility that we all share. Colombia reiterates its commitment to its implementation in good faith, as well as safeguarding the essentially protective and humanitarian nature that lies at the root of its history in our region, and certainly which we will always defend. That is the principle of ensuring unity in diversity. Thank you very much, Chair.
Muchas gracias, Colombia, por su
Thank you very much, Colombia. Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. My delegation salutes the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Peru, Mr. Hugo de Sela. We take note of his intervention. Chile is just a party on the Convention on Political Asylum. However, we have always respected the principles established in this instrument, and when it comes to this topic, particularly the Convention on Diplomatic Asylum, as standards of international law that are generally recognized in our country. In that sense, our willingness has been to look at the guiding components of these instruments, which we have considered in political and legal issues of both domestic and international affairs, which necessarily are considered in each particular case. For Chile, in line with the statement from the Inter-American Court on Human Rights in its advisory opinion 1125/18, the right to asylum is a human right that has developed in our region, and as a result, asylum is a guiding principle that falls on any institutions for international protection. And in our view, it means that granting diplomatic asylum and its scope must be guided by the conventions that regulate it, as well as domestic legislation whenever this is an act of foreign policy, aside from the sovereignty of any state deciding to grant asylum. Chair, the tradition of asylum goes back a long time, and it is dynamic, and therefore our country aspires to ensuring that asylum is maintained as it stands, that is, protection granted by a state in its territory to an individual who has requested that international protection. This allows us to sustain the essential nature of that institution, which is no less than the protection of a human being as a humanitarian act without discrimination, and therefore this falls on their fundamental human rights. In any case, we understand that there are particular circumstances where one state has the right to form its own opinion on these topics. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Chile.
Thank you, Chile. Costa Rica. Foreign Minister Hugo de Sela, Chair of the Permanent Council, ASG, distinguished representatives. Costa Rica is grateful for convening this special session, and also thank you very much for the Foreign Minister for being here in order to reflect on an institution that, as the Foreign Minister stated, is deeply rooted in the legal tradition of our region, that is diplomatic asylum. Today's context invites us to address this topic with seriousness, carefulness, and a sense of responsibility as required by international law and the inter-American system. Our position is fully in line with the continuity of what we have expressed at this Permanent Council as of April last year. That is, we reiterated that asylum is a fundamental institution and it protects life and the freedom of persons who have been persecuted for political reasons. In the Americas, its validity is sustained on a robust regulatory framework which includes the Havana Convention, the Caracas Convention on Diplomatic Asylum, and the very legal precedents of the inter-American system. Costa Rica sustains that asylum must be granted with strict adherence to its essential principles. It cannot be used as an instrument to avoid justice for common crimes, nor may it be a tool for political confrontation between states. At the same time, it may not be weakened or questioned when its end is to protect anyone who finds himself in real and imminent risk. Strengthening asylum requires shared responsibility, and we support any effort aimed at building spaces for dialogue, regulatory clarity, and cooperation between states, as we have stated on many occasions where we have addressed this topic in the framework of the CAJP. Any differences with regard to the implementation of asylum must be resolved diplomatically, with dialogue, the appropriate institutional channels, and with strict respect for the inviolability of diplomatic facilities and the system of treaties in force. Costa Rica reiterates its belief that international law is the foundation for preserving peace and peaceful coexistence between our peoples. Diplomatic asylum is part of that legal and historical legacy in the Americas, and the responsibility of this Permanent Council is to continue protecting it and promoting its use with responsibility. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Costa Rica, for your intervention. Paraguay, please. Thank you very much, Chair. I'm delighted and honored to be here with the Minister of Foreign Relations of Peru, Mr. Hugo de Sela, and also warm greetings to the ASG. First of all, my delegation would like to thank you for the presentation from the Foreign Minister of Peru, a topic that's extremely important when it comes to preserving respectful diplomatic relations and peace between nations of the Americas. In Paraguay, the right to asylum is part of our Constitution, and in our Article 43 of the Constitution enshrines the right to territorial and diplomatic asylum to any individual who is persecuted due to political ideas and political persecution, as well as any related common crimes. Diplomatic asylum is a humanitarian figure, and the main objective is protecting the life and freedom of anyone who is persecuted for political reasons. This principle is fundamental and very clearly established in the Convention of Caracas from 1954. The Republic of Paraguay, as a state party, reiterates its staunch commitment to this convention, and we remind you that this is a legal instrument that is unique globally, as it has positive regulation for the practice of asylum in political and diplomatic facilities. And strict adherence to the Caracas Convention is important in strengthening and promoting friendly relations of cooperation between the countries of the Americas. And yet, in order to ensure the legitimacy and that this institution is lasting, we believe it's essential for us to strike a balance. My delegation believes that assessing the nature of the crime and the motives for persecution of the individual seeking protection means that the asylum-granting state must have seriously heard and addressed the criteria provided by the territorial state. This exercise of crucial good faith must avoid granting asylum being weakened as a way to avoid justice. We must preserve its humanitarian nature. We fully believe in the capacity of our states to resolve any diplomatic disagreement through direct, clear dialogue and exchanges based on good faith between the asylum-granting state and the territorial state in the framework of international law. It is possible for us to overcome these challenges. This is the only way for us to continue ensuring cordial, respectful, and unified inter-American relations. Finally, Chair, I would like to thank you very much for the document that you have provided, which will be duly studied. Thank you very much.
por su intervención.
Thank you, Paraguay, for your remarks. Panama, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Assistant Secretary General, I'd like to begin by giving a warm welcome to the Foreign Minister of Peru, His Excellency Mr. Hugo de Sela, and thank him for his presentation on the institution of diplomatic asylum, of which we have taken due note. Mr. Chair, diplomatic relations are the base on which our ties between nations are founded. It's an instrument through which we promote dialogue, we strengthen mutual trust, and we resolve differences in a peaceful manner. In order for these relations to be effective, we must have them based on universal principles, mutual respect, sovereignty, and non-interference in states' internal operations. The inter-American system and international law, as well, and the Charter of the UN and the OAS establish norms and principles that are essential to guiding our interactions, including respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-intervention. Observing these principles is necessary for regional peace and stability. And within that context, Panama clearly and firmly reaffirmed its commitment to observance of norms that guide diplomatic relations, particularly diplomatic asylum. Our country, due to historic, legal, and regional reasons, of which you are all aware, is very much firm on this point. Diplomatic asylum is a peaceful and humanitarian tool that should be used to protect those who are facing political persecution due to political motivations or whose safety is at risk. It is necessary to save lives, and that is why it is a necessary tool that makes a part of the inter-American system. Preserving its integrity is not just a legal responsibility, but a moral imperative. I'd like to highlight here that Panama is of the opinion that any action or omission or reinterpretation that might weaken that institution would fly in the face of the original principles and historic context in which we find ourselves. This convention is fully in force, and it is just as important now as it was when it was first consecrated in the beginning of our inter-American system, and that is why our region must respond with responsibility to make sure that it is not eroded. Mr. Chair, in the last few years, this organization has had to take up on several occasions topics related to asylum. Most recently, we saw on December 11th, 2024, during which a permanent council session called for by Argentina, we examined the issue of Venezuelan asylees in the Argentinian embassy in Caracas. And in that session, most member states reaffirmed our commitment to human rights, inviolability of diplomatic missions, and full respect for the right to diplomatic asylum established in the inter-American system. And this is a good time to recognize that there was a group of countries that published a shared opinion exhorting Venezuela to fulfill its international responsibility by providing safe passage necessary to guarantee that the asylees had a safe exit that was unrestricted towards safe territory. Panama reaffirms its historic profile of mutual understanding and respect, but also recognizing that the right to political asylum is a human right and that it should not be used as a tool to elude regular legal processes. However, it is an irreplaceable tool for those who are escaping political persecution or seeking liberty and safety. And that is why we, Mr. Chair, firmly but respectfully demand that all member states act to preserve this tool in full adherence to international law. Diplomatic asylum cannot be subject to political whims. It must be guided by our hemispheric agreement, and we call on this organization to strengthen the defense of the institution of diplomatic asylum, guaranteeing the inviolability of diplomatic missions and guaranteeing cooperation that is based on respect and legality as well as constructive dialogue. It is only thus that we will be able to move towards a more stable, safe, and committed region that is committed to human dignity. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Panama, for your remarks. Seeing no further requests for the floor from member states, we have wrapped up the order of business for today's special session. The remarks and observations made will be duly reflected in the minutes. I'd like to thank as well the Foreign Minister of Peru for his presence and the delegations for their presence. The session is ended. Thank you.